Okay, so today we're going to be talking about cognitive biases, basically. So we're shifting gears very much. We're shifting from talking about the question of what is ideally rational, like what would make perfect sense for a person to do. How should you behave if you want your beliefs to be as accurate as possible? So that's a normative question. Now we're going to shift from that normative question to asking more descriptive questions, at least for this class and probably for the next week, about how people actually reason. And it's going to be helpful, I hope, because in the context of informal reasoning, really we're much less perfect than we would like. Like the ideal description of rationality fits only very imperfectly with how people actually reason. And the hope is that if you have a clearer picture of how people actually reason and how you actually reason, you can get those two things closer together, hopefully. Okay, so I'm just basically going to go through and talk about some cognitive biases and some of the reasons why we might have these biases. I want to throw up a warning ahead of time that there's going to be generalizations being made here. So one tempting inference, so I'm going to say a bunch of stuff like, you know, this study found that people do this study found that people did that. And there are two steps of that are hazardous inferences. So one, there's an inductive generalization where they did the study, the original study, right? So they took a group of people and they saw what they did under various conditions, and then they generalized from that to like everybody, right? So they do an inductive generalization, take a sample, and make an inference about a population. Can you guys hear me okay? Is that all right? Okay. So that's one step at which these things that I'm going to tell you might be less than perfectly accurate or less than perfectly representative. So the samples that they took might be unrepresentative of the general population. Usually the samples are Western undergraduate students, typically. Like that's the main subject of research studies. So if somebody doesn't match exactly that profile, maybe these things don't apply to them. There's a second step, though, that you might be tempted to make. So once you've got the generalization, you might be tempted to say, well, that's true of the population, so it's true of me, or it's true of you. And that's doing the opposite direction of taking a generalization and thinking that it applies to a subpopulation or even individual. So the generalizations I'm going to present to you today do not hold over all subpopulations. They hold over the average population. Assuming they did the science right, they hold over the average population. That doesn't mean that they apply to every single person in the population, right? So if you say 90% of people do X, well, that leaves 10% of the population for whom the generalization does not apply, okay? So just as a kind of warning, I know that sounds broad and kind of like generic, like, oh, isn't that always true? And yeah, it is kind of always true, but I think it's especially important to keep in mind with this stuff because it's like the fallacies stuff, this biases research can be misused, right? You can have a distorted impression of how it applies to individuals. For example, most of the stuff we'll talk about today applies mainly to quote unquote normal people, like psychologically healthy people. And if you look at subpopulations like depressed people or severely anxious people, these generalizations don't hold anymore. Yeah? Okay. Just by way of warning. So keep that in mind. For everything that we're going to talk about, those things should be kept in mind. Okay, so cognitive biases. We've seen at least a couple already. I'll just remind you of the two that I've talked about in this class already because I thought they were especially relevant to critical thinking. The first one was belief bias. Belief bias being the tendency to believe that an argument is valid when you think its conclusion and its premises are true, right? So we've done a lot of work to tease those two things apart, of course, but the fact is that when you ask people, when you test people in a laboratory setting, you ask, do you think this argument is valid? If they believe the premises and conclusion, they're more likely to believe the argument is valid, right? So that's just kind of a, you like arguments or you're convinced by arguments if you already believe the conclusion. So something to keep in mind, and that's going to be generally important whenever you're assessing arguments, of course. So remind yourself of that. I also talked briefly about confirmation bias. That is the tendency to pay more attention or to think evidence is more relevant when it agrees with what you already think. Have you guys heard of these before? Like, hands up if you've encountered cognitive biases literature before. Some people. Good. Okay, so I'm glad it's like less than half. So hopefully there'll still be something in this for you, but like, yeah, so those are the two that I thought were most centrally relevant to critical reasoning as such, because they're specifically about arguments and belief formation. We're going to look at a bunch more that are sort of less strictly relevant, so we're broadening our horizons a little bit. But I think nonetheless, when you're in your life evaluating arguments, all of these will be relevant some of the time. Right. So one thing you might ask yourself, so psychologists have convinced themselves and convinced a lot of people, me included, that we've got all kinds of these biases, right? We've got, if you go to Wikipedia, look at the list of biases, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of separate ways in which people's average cognitive performance differs from the ideal, right? So we've got these ideal models of rationality. We've been talking about these ideal models of rationality all semester. And when you put people in these situations and see whether they act ideally, they act less than ideally. And something that you might ask yourself about that fact is like, why? Why are we like this? As far as I can tell, there are two hypotheses on the table for how humans came about. Either we were created or we evolved. And in either case, this question should arise for you. So if we were created, why were we made so badly? Like, why were we made to have all of these terrible biases built into our reasoning? That seems like poor design, right? And you can ask the exact same question about the case where you believe we evolved. If we evolved, why would we evolve to have biases in our reasoning? That doesn't seem like it makes any sense. Why wouldn't we be built to be perfectly rational? Isn't that better? Right? I'll start off with sort of one reason why we might have these biases built in, and then develop another one about halfway through. The first one has to do with this story. Remember the story I told you about DENNETT'S robots? So this is a story about trying to build a robot that can do stuff like find power sources for itself, right? So the robot, his job is to get the battery, but there's a bomb on the wagon, and it doesn't realize, if you don't make it deduce the side effects of its actions, if it only deduces the effects of its actions and not the side effects, it pulls the wagon and the bomb blows up and it dies. If you tell it to decide the side effects of its actions, then it gets stuck in an infinite loop of deducing irrelevant side effects. And then if you tell it to sort relevant from irrelevant side effects, it again gets stuck in an infinite loop of, well, okay, the wheels are going to turn and that's going to not affect the day of the week. That's irrelevant. The wheels are going to turn and it's not going to make the barometer go up. That's irrelevant. You know, so it goes through this infinite list, knocking things off as irrelevant. Okay, so the point of that story was that it's a built-in feature of cognition. If you find yourself to be not a god, that is to have less than infinite information and less than infinite computational power, you're going to have to cut some corners somewhere. You're going to have to ignore almost everything almost all the time. Yeah? So that was the moral of that story, was that, hey, we are finite rational agents. And that means that we're pretty much stuck with less than perfect cognitive strategies. So like, how does the strategy of ignoring almost everything almost all the time strike you? As a cognitive strategy, is that like, oh, that sounds great, no problem there, we're going to get it right all the time? I hope it doesn't. I hope that strikes you as a risky strategy, as a strategy that's clearly less than perfect, right? Like, ignoring almost everything almost all the time is going to leave you vulnerable to making mistakes at least some of the time, right? That seems clear enough to me. Certainly with simple, well-defined problems like playing tic-tac-toe or like playing checkers, You can come up with ideal reasoning strategies. You can nail down exactly what the right thing to do is. So you don't face this problem all the time, but you do face it in the broad, ill-defined world of like informal reasoning, right? So we're kind of, so here's one argument, here's one reason why we might be stuck with these biases, is because they're not, it's not that we ever had the option of reasoning perfectly. It's that we are stuck as finite agents, we are stuck with the fact that we are going to be reasoning imperfectly, and all we can do is do our best with, you know, the limited resources that we have. So there's one reason why God and or evolution might make us less than perfect. I think framing effects are a nice example of this. So the Dennett robot story is meant to show you that it's meant to illustrate the frame problem. That is the problem of putting a finite frame around your world and knowing what to pay attention to within that frame, right? So that's how you solve, like, more or less, that's how you solve this problem of having way too much information and not enough time to sort it out. You put a frame around your world, right? But framing things has, you know, it has clear upsides because now you've got a limited scope of things you have to worry about, but it also has downsides. It also makes you vulnerable to bias in certain ways. So here's a story from, this is the second story I told you from the Zhuangzi, but the story of the monkeys. He says, when the monkey trainer was handing out acorns, he said, "You get 3 in the morning and 4 at night." This made all the monkeys furious. The monkeys can speak, by the way. "Well then," he said, "you get 4 in the morning and 3 at night." The monkeys were all delighted. Ha ha ha, stupid monkeys. Yeah? Clearly the monkeys are being irrational. So what's the point of that story? Clearly the monkeys are being irrational, right? Clearly the monkeys have been presented the exact same thing, the exact same number of acorns in 2 different frameworks, and one time they were excited and one time they were mad. Ha ha ha, stupid monkeys. We would never be like that, right? We would never be so foolish as to react differently to the exact same information presented the same way. Well, of course we do. This is called framing effects. So people react much more favorably if you describe something like, say, like a medical procedure. If you say this medical procedure is 95% successful, it's like, oh, that sounds like a good deal. If you tell them this has a 5% failure rate, people are much less happy with that, right? But if we were reasoning ideally, of course, you should react exactly the same way to those 2 facts. Those 2 facts imply each other. There is absolutely no difference. It's sort of in your chances between those 2. But one of them people are happy with, and one of them people are much less happy with. Yeah? So we act like the monkeys. We act like the monkeys and their acorns in a wide variety of contexts. And marketers are extremely acutely aware of this. They use framing effects all the time to affect your behavior. So if you've ever gone into a restaurant and there's one dish that's like, you know, most of the mains are like $12 or $15, and there's one that's like $38, chances are they don't expect you to buy the $38 main. Right? Chances are they threw that on the menu to make everything else look more reasonably priced. So this is how they put the frame that they want around your options, right? So if you, and people, they don't do this because they just think it might help. It's strongly established that people will react better if there's a one outlier. So if you go on a website and there's like, you know, there's a couple of $50 items and then a $1,000 item, you're much more likely to buy the $50 item than if it was just $50. Because if the top price is $50, you're like, oh, 50, I don't know. Yeah. Is that why prices end in 99? It could be. I'm not really sure. Like, I'm not sure if it's exactly the same effect, but certainly they're doing the same kind of thing. They're trying to get you to like perceive the price differently than otherwise. Yeah. Yeah. I'm not sure which exactly effect that is, but yeah. Yeah? People do this in negotiations all the time. It's called the anchoring effect. So the first offer, so if you're negotiating a wage, say, and you say, I think I should get $50 an hour, that kind of like sets the frame for what would be reasonable for the negotiations to go from there, right? Anchoring effects, framing effects. In case you're hoping that education will solve this for you, I have bad news. It will not. So here's an example. 93% of PhD students register early when it was described there was a penalty for late registration. Say, if you register late, we're going to penalize you. We're going to hit you for a bit of extra money. 67% did so when they were told there's a discount for early registration. Same dates, same costs. You know, this is 3 in the morning and 4 at night. But these potential grad students who were supposed to be the intellectual cream of the crop reacted drastically differently when it was framed as a punishment or as a possible benefit. People are much more averse to being punished than they are attracted to getting small benefits. Yeah? So if I said to you, I'll give you a 5% bonus on your thing if you hand it in early, or if I say I'll give you 5% penalty for handing in late, you'll tend much more strongly to the 5% penalty than you would to the bonus, even though they end up being exactly the same. Okay, so there's that, framing effects. And I would propose to you that these things fall out of just this basic feature of our cognition that you need to put a frame around the world. You need some kind of framework to engage with the world just to limit the amount of data you have to deal with. And the way you frame the situation impacts the way you process it. Right? So this is, you know, why have we got these weird framing effects? It's really, I would suggest to you, a consequence of just being finite agents dealing with a world that's way, way bigger than you. Okay. So that might be okay as far as it goes. You know, being finite could explain why we're less than perfect. Yeah? So that should be acceptable enough. You know, why are we less than perfect? Well, you got these tiny little primate brains. They're made of meat. You know, they're not ideal. But then there's a question about, so that's just explaining a couple of the biases. We have this whole pattern of biases, right? Systematic biases that show up over and over again in different contexts. And the question is, why have we got the specific biases that we've got? Yeah? So why exactly, like if we were just made badly, you don't expect it to be systematic in the way that it is biased, right? If we were just constructed poorly, you'd expect people to make mistakes kind of in all directions, and they'd more or less cancel each other out, right? But that's not what we find. When you look at how people act and behave, our biases are systematic. And that seems to call for some kind of explanation. So I'd like to sort of develop for you one potential explanation for how we got like this, and that it's actually that a lot of these biases have useful effects. Useful effects. So what we've been talking about so far in this course is what does ideal rationality look like? So if you believe that being ideally rational, that is to have reasoning that is most likely to give you true beliefs all of the time, that's one goal, right? And if you want to do that, then you should be as close to ideal rationality as humanly possible. But suppose that's not your only goal. Suppose your other goals include like feeding yourself, staying warm, being popular, reproducing, or supporting close relatives who did reproduce, right? Those are also goals that don't necessarily line up with the goal of being right all the time. This is the lesson of my high school life. Being right all the time is not the only important thing. This is the suggestion being advanced here. So, yeah, so biases are instances of less than perfect reasoning, but maybe they are adaptive in some ways. So if you look at the various biases that we've got, one way of thinking about them is asking, does this serve some useful purpose for the human who has them? Okay? So mostly what we're going to do for the rest of the class is go through a bunch of biases and try to look at them through this perspective. Okay. So, and I'm going to be drawing on this fun paper called The Paranoid Optimist by Hazelton and Nettle. And then they argue that you can explain the pattern of biases that we have, both optimistic and pessimistic, or paranoid, they say, in terms of error management, right? Error management. So, we're finite beings. We have less than perfect minds. We have less than perfect information. Usually we're making decisions with less time than you'd want. So you're pretty much guaranteed to make some mistakes. Sometimes you're not going to get it right. And the question is, how do you manage that fact, right? How do you build into the system the fact that you're going to get it wrong some of the time and nonetheless be better off than you would have if you hadn't managed your errors? So in that context, so if you know you're going to get it wrong at least some of the time, the thing to do is to bias your reasoning towards committing low-cost errors and away from committing high-cost errors, right? So sometimes, very often, the cost of getting it wrong in one way is not the same as the cost of getting it wrong in the other. So you bias yourself towards, or whatever produced us, biased us towards low-cost errors. Yeah? That's the suggestion. And this is gonna be the framework. So these guys interpret basically all of our cognitive biases through this framework and say we can explain why we're like this if you keep in mind the costs of getting it wrong in given cases. Okay? So keep that in mind. We'll sort of talk about it in each case. They call this the fire detector effect. So consider fire detectors, smoke detectors, sorry. Sometimes it makes sense to build a bias into the system, like smoke detectors. Smoke detectors are oversensitive by design. I don't know about you, I can't cook without setting off my smoke detector. I can't roast anything without setting off my smoke detector, and that's the way I want it, right? Because the cost of a false positive, that is the smoke detector going off when my apartment's not on fire, is fairly low. It freaks out the cats, I have to open the door, that's about it, right? There's not a big deal. Whereas the cost of it not going off when my apartment is on fire is very high. Me and my family die, possibly, right? So the cost of a false negative, that is saying that there's not a problem when there is one, is extremely high. The cost of a false positive, saying there is a problem when it turns out there isn't one, is relatively low, right? And that's why they designed smoke detectors to be more sensitive than they probably need to be. They don't design smoke detectors to only ever go off when your apartment's on fire, right? And you don't want them to do that. You want them to make them very, very sensitive. And the suggestion is, so that's the smoke detector effect or smoke detector principle, and they want to interpret basically human cognitive biases through the lens of this. You say, we're smoke detectors. We're designed to be exquisitely sensitive to things that would be a high-cost error and less sensitive to things that would be a low-cost error. Yeah? Okay. So let's go through some biases and try to think about them in these terms. So just a really simple one, a really kind of perceptual one. It's less cognitive, more perceptual. It's the time to impact bias. So this one's nice because you're not asking people about their complex opinions about the world. What you've got is a setup where the subject is sitting and then you have a speaker either moving towards them or moving away from them, and they're asked to judge how long it's going to be before the sound gets to them. Right? So they're assessing how soon is that thing that I hear going to get to me. And people systematically underestimate the time it's going to take to get to them when it's moving towards them, but they don't do that when it's moving away. Okay, so why is that helpful? Yeah. So things don't hit you, right. So think about this in terms of the costs and benefits of being wrong in one direction or the other. Say there's a tiger coming towards you and you can hear its footfalls. The cost of being wrong in the direction of thinking, of being over-prepared, right? You're like, oh, here it comes and it's still 10 feet away. The cost of that is pretty low, right? The cost of being underprepared and not being ready when the tiger arrives is very high. Your lunch, right? Same with a car or something flying towards you, right? So if you hear a car coming towards you, you're much better off underestimating how much time you have, because then you're over-prepared. The worst case scenario in that is you're standing there looking a little silly. And in the opposite direction, you're dead or severely injured. Yeah? So we've got this built in as a perceptual bias. You know, your brain is not telling you the truth about how long it's going to be before a sound gets to you. And you don't want it to tell you the truth. You want it to be systematically biased towards making the low-cost error, not the high-cost error. So thanks, brain, for telling lies to me, I guess. You know, yeah. So that's a nice one, and it nicely illustrates the smoke detector effect, I hope. Right. Okay, so let's get into the more cognitive biases. And the Paranoid Optimist paper separates them largely into positive biases and negative biases. So we'll do the positive biases first. So they say, I'll just quote them, people have been shown to have unrealistically positive views of the self, unwarranted optimism about the future, and to believe they control the flow of events to a greater extent than is logically warranted. All right. So, like, you think you're better than you are, you think you are more in control than you are, and you think that things are going to go better than they are. Well, you is the wrong way of putting that, right? Okay, so go back to that thing I said at the very beginning about doing the inductive syllogism here. People on average think that they are better at stuff than they are. A depressed person thinks that they are worse. A depressed or an anxious person thinks that they are worse at stuff than they actually are, typically, right? So not all subpopulations, but this is the general trend. And let's do some examples. So 90% of drivers rate themselves as above average. Think about that next time you're on the road. What do you know about how many people are above average drivers? 50%. It's 50%. You don't have to go out in the world to check that. 50% of people are above average drivers, 50% are below. But 90% of people rate them as above average, themselves as above average. Okay, so what we're doing here is not establishing, so this is a kind of tricky inference. Like, look at what they're doing here. What they're doing is saying, we know that if people were getting it right, they would come up with 50% of people would rate themselves above and 50% would rate themselves below. But we know that people don't do that because 90% are saying that they're above average. So they haven't actually like gotten inside people's heads and seen who's making the error or why. They're just looking at the averages. But it's still evidence that people are getting it wrong in a systematic way. So if people were just bad at judging in general how good they are at being a driver, you would expect their errors to cancel each other out, right? Some people would get it wrong in one way and some people get it wrong in the other. But this is a pretty strong effect in one direction. That is, people believe that they are good drivers. So can you, to go back to this sort of error management stuff, like can you think why it might be helpful for somebody to have an excess of, and it's not just driving, it's a lot of things, an excess of confidence in their abilities? Yeah. Yeah, that's right. So if you're too anxious to operate, you can't do anything. You severely impede your own performance by having an excessively negative self-image. So these positive biases are generally explained in terms of kind of like trying to keep you together as a person, right? Trying to keep you functional by having a positive view of yourself. And if the model that I'm presenting to you is correct, that actually works. Either evolution sifted for this property or God made us this way. So one way or the other, this is actually an adaptive strategy. You kind of don't want to get rid of these optimistic biases. You kind of want to keep them. Psychologically healthy people tend to have these biases, these positive biases. The average married person believes there is no chance that they will get divorced. No chance. 50% of marriages end in divorce. The average person thinks that there is no chance. Well, I mean, that might be an adaptive illusion. That might be a good illusion to have, because if you believe there's like, maybe 50-50 I'm going to get divorced, you might start like backing out of your commitments, right? You might bring less to the table than you otherwise would have, right? You might say, well, I don't really want to work out my complex social communication issues. I don't want to have to articulate my feelings because I'm probably going to get divorced anyway, so screw it. I'll just try again with the next person. That's probably not an adaptive strategy, right? So if you have the illusion that you are confident that you're going to be married for the rest of your life, maybe that's better for you. And 86% of parents rate their children as having more positive attributes than average. Again, like that's probably good for your psychological health. It's like, my kid is great. I don't know, maybe that helps. That does mean that 14% of parents didn't rate their children as above average. So it's certainly not like a universal effect. But okay, so these are optimistic biases. There are also a wide variety of pessimistic biases. So you probably can't read this, but they say the sinister attribution error is when people are feeling insecure, when they're feeling less than fully comfortable, they tend to assume that people are judging them more severely than they actually are. So they did things like put people, a first-year undergrad in some situation where they make a minor error, and then they ask them, what did everybody else in the room think of you? And people report thinking that other people had judged them much more harshly than they actually had. That's kind of good news, right? Like you have a tendency when you're feeling insecure to be very, very sensitive to other people's perceptions of you, right? Oversensitive to people's perceptions of you. Now, if you're trying to, for humans, being accepted by your social group for the last couple 100,000 years was a matter of life and death, right? A single human all by themselves is useless. You can't survive by yourself in the wilderness, or your chances are extremely low compared to how your chances if you have 150 good friends who are willing to help and share with you, right? So being accepted by your social group was an extremely important factor for most of our history. So it's extremely important that you not piss people off, especially when you're trying to get into a new social group. So it's not the case that we were just born in a social group and stayed there for our entire lives. Typically, people move around, they switch groups. So when you're trying to get into a new group, it turns out that people are hypersensitive to other people's opinions of them. And again, that might be adaptive. That might be because the cost of getting it wrong, the cost of wandering into a new social group and making everybody mad and not noticing is very high. The cost of wandering into a new social group and thinking people are mad at you, but turns out they actually weren't, that's less severe, right? Like it's not great, you're still feeling bad about yourself when you didn't need to, but it's a much less serious error to make. So the cost of that error is substantially less than the cost of thinking you're doing great and everybody's mad at you, yeah? Now that's mitigated by how comfortable they are in the group. So this bias goes away or is substantially diminished the better you know the people that you're working with, the better that you're sort of accepted and comfortable in your social group, right? So this is very much about how do you get into a new social group. So yeah, so they say participants committed an experimentally induced social gaffe, failing at a simple anagram test or being described in an embarrassing manner. In 4 studies, the participants believed that they were judged as less intelligent and less favorable in their general impression by strangers than they actually were. Huh? Okay. Here's another one, another pessimistic bias, this time in the context of romantic relationships. So in the context of romantic relationships, this group found men and women tended to underestimate the degree to which their partners had forgiven them after a transgression. For example, insults, flirting with others, and so on. With transgression severity controlled, this bias was strongest in partnerships characterized by less relationship satisfaction. Yeah? So you've got this bias, people seem to have this bias of thinking that they've made their partners angrier than they actually did, and that they've been forgiven less than they actually were forgiven. And that bias is strongest when you're feeling insecure about the relationship. Yeah? And again, think about it in terms of costs and benefits of being wrong in either direction. If you get your partner like a nice present because you think they're still mad at you, but they weren't still mad at you, what happens? You got them a nice present for no reason. Like that's not so bad. Yeah? If you think you've been forgiven and you haven't, now what happens? That's bad. I will tell you that that's bad. If you think everything's cool, if you act like everything's cool and it's not, that's bad. Yeah? Okay, so the cost of getting it wrong in one direction is not the same as the cost of getting it wrong in another direction. Okay. I'm just gonna, if you guys are good, I'm gonna just plow through this. I don't think we have a full 2 hours today, so we'll just keep on going, yeah? Okay. Bad news, guys. So in heterosexual men tend to overestimate the sexual interest that women have in them. They test this by doing like speed dating things. So you have people do like a 4-minute interaction, and then they rate how interested you are in them and how interested you think they were in you. This is I'm really oversimplifying this. There's a bunch of like complex mitigating factors, but the moral of the story is men tend to overestimate how interested women are. Yeah? And conversely, women tend to underestimate how interested men are in them. Okay, now, this is bordering on evolutionary psychology, which I think you should be extremely suspicious of, because it's a field that's rife with people making really too quick generalizations, really pat stories, like stories that really don't hold up to careful thought. So be cautious here. It's also the case that we haven't done sufficient work. I don't think evolutionary psychologists have done sufficient work to tease out culture and nature. Like how much of this is a product of the culture of the people that were in the studies and how much is just sort of like written into their genes. So with all that in mind, think about this from an evolutionary standpoint. So from an evolutionary standpoint, the goal is to have babies or to have your close relatives have babies, right? That's what success looks like according to evolution. Not you being happy or having a nice life or contributing to humanity or creating great art. It's really just making babies. So for heterosexual men for whom the biological investment in just procreation is relatively small, missing a reproductive opportunity is a disaster, right? If reproducing is the only goal, I don't recommend that as your only goal, but if reproducing was your only goal, missing a reproductive opportunity is a disaster. So better to annoy some women than to miss out on a reproductive opportunity from the perspective of evolution. Not from the perspective of being a human being, frankly, but, you know. Okay. And there's a kind of converse of this with commitment. So young women tend to underestimate the degree to which men are interested in a committed relationship. So they underestimate the degree of commitment of their partners or potential partners. And again, from this quite ugly and amoral evolutionary perspective, you can think about this in terms of the costs and benefits of being wrong. So the typical story here is that women have a much larger investment in reproduction. So the typical story is it's on the woman to take care of the baby for the rest of its life unless the guy hangs around. I'm not sure that that has any relationship to how humans have been for the last couple 100,000 years, because we always lived in groups, right? It's not like a single mom like in the jungle by herself or something like that. So we were always working in groups. So, you know, grain of salt, big heaping tablespoon of salt, but nonetheless, the cost of being wrong about how committed somebody is to you can be very large if you are stuck raising the kid. The cost of like being wrong in the other direction is relatively low, right? Relatively low. You're like, I want more information about your levels of commitment. So if they are genuinely committed, that shouldn't be a big problem for them to, yes, baby, I love you. Yes, no, I want to be with you for the rest of my life. Yes, baby, you know, I really care. You know, let's get a dog or whatever. So the cost of being wrong in one direction and thinking that the person is less committed than they actually are is relatively low compared to the cost of thinking, yeah, this is the guy, he's going to be with me forever, and then he leaves. Yeah? So this is the supposed, I'm going to double down on this, really want to emphasize how sketchy some of these inferences are, but this is the story anyway. Part of the evidence for this is supposed to be the difference between perceptions in young women and postmenopausal women. So after menopause, the opportunity for reproduction is past, and when you test postmenopausal women, they don't have this effect. Right? They don't have a bias towards underestimating commitment levels. So if the story I was just telling you is right, it predicts that this should be the case, right? Because if this is concern about, if commitment about concern is commitment about securing a partner who can help you raise a child, then after your child rearing days are over, that's no longer a concern, and the cost of being wrong goes away. Yeah? Again, the smoke detector effect. This is, I went through these biases carefully to try to find the least gross ones, or the ones that like have the least twisted like consequences. This is my best shot at it. All right, something less touchy. Outgroup homogeneity effect, the outgroup homogeneity effect. So people have a tendency to judge members of an in-group as more diverse than members of an out-group. So your in-group is the people that you consider your people, the people in your family or your sorority or fraternity, the people in your university. Those sort of like embedded rings of in-groups and out-groups. I don't know if they did this to you in your first year. When I did Frosh in the first year of my university, there was like a hierarchy of who's the out-group. So somebody in my house was my in-group, right? These are your buddies. These are your house. You know, these are your people. If you meet somebody from another house, they're the out-group. Those are the bad guys. And you're supposed to like dump all your aggression and anger towards the out-group, I guess as a bonding exercise. But then if somebody from another college showed up, now that person from the other house is in your in-group, and the person in the other college is the out-group. It's like, oh, this is it's an even outer group, and now you band together to get mad at them. God forbid if somebody from York showed up. Now they're the, like those are the people that you can really dump on those people without fear, because they're the out-group. You can export all of your anger and frustration and confusion at being a young person taken away from your family and in a new environment, and you just dump it into the out-group. Okay, so in-group, out-group effects, there's all kinds of stuff about this in psychology. People really seem to have a strong tendency to think in these terms, like who's in my circle and who's out. And you tend to treat people differently based on whether they're in or out. One such effect is the out-group homogeneity effect, where people judge people in their in-group to be more different from each other than people in the out-group. Yeah? So 90 sorority members were asked to judge the degree of diversity in their sorority compared to the degree of diversity in another sorority. 3 different groups, all assessing each other, and all of them said, we are the more diverse group than you guys. Yeah? They said, my sorority sisters are so complex and individual. Each one is unique. Each one has their own special properties. Y'all look the same to me, though. You all are just sort of like sorority bunnies. My people are interesting and complex. And this generalizes. It's not just sororities. It's when you perceive another group to be out-group, you tend to lump them together. You, the editorial you. We tend to lump them together. Whereas if you perceive them to be in-group, suddenly you're able or willing to accept that there are differences, that there's complexities, that there's nuances. I'm not exactly sure how to explain this in terms of the smoke detector effect. I welcome your input, but I suspect it's something to do with how much cognitive energy you want to spend trying to understand people. It's a pain in the butt trying to understand people. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of mental energy, space in your head, and you've only got so much of it. So if it's in your in-group, it's probably more in your interest to spend the time to actually figure out what people are like and accept that you're going to have to do some work and not treat everybody the same. Whereas if it's in the out-group, I don't know, maybe it's more like Frosh Week where you can afford to care less about them, right? You can afford to care less about the out-group because making them mad is much less serious than making your close friends mad. That's what I would propose. Okay. Just to round this out with a fun one, the blind spot bias. People tend to underestimate the degree to which they are subject to biases. It's the bias to complement the fallacy. Yeah, if you ask people, hey, are people biased? Do people have these biases? They go, oh yeah, oh for sure. You can see it everywhere. Everybody's got these biases. Do you have these biases? No, not really. And so I'll give you the quote here. Blind spot bias appears to be a unique construct independent of intelligence and personality traits related to self-esteem, self-enhancement, and self-presentation. Okay, so there wasn't a correlation. When they tried to do correlations, they say, okay, some people are less willing to see themselves as biased. They say, I'm not biased, you're biased. And that tendency was unrelated to intelligence or self-esteem. Okay? So if you think, I'm not biased, I'm smart. No. I'm not biased, I have good feelings about myself. No. Unrelated, right? Blind spot bias appears to be independent of general decision-making competence. I'm not biased, I make good decisions. Nah. In other words, the belief that one is less biased than one's peers appears to reflect a biased perception of the self rather than a more general inferior decision-making ability or an accurate reflection of one's superior judgment and decision-making ability. I think this is really important to keep in mind because more or less the only hope you have of mitigating the bad effects of having these biases is to admit to yourself the possibility that you're subject to them. So it's easier to do that, of course, if you don't believe that being smart protects you from being biased. It's easier to do that if you don't believe that being a good decision maker in general protects you from being biased. They don't. Yeah? And everything that I've said so far should be at least something of an argument for you about why that could be the case. If these biases are actually adaptive, if they are features of a healthy, robust psyche that's going to succeed in the world, then it should be unrelated to whether you're messed up and dumb, right? Yeah? So being a biased decision maker is not a bug, it's a feature. Sort of, right? I hope that you all are at least somewhat disturbed by this. Like if you haven't encountered this before, I hope you're at least a little bit unsettled by this material because most people assume that they're actually pretty good at reasoning, or at least that they're not systematically deluded about themselves and their world. But nonetheless, I don't want you to be so disturbed that you reject this as impossible or that you can't accept that it might apply to you as well. Because really, I don't know how else to cope with any of this than to like bring it into your field of view, right? And the self-serving biases were all about protecting your sense of yourself, which you really do need to do. Like, if you don't have some strategy for understanding yourself as a worthwhile person, you're in deep trouble. That's a vital function like your liver or your spleen plays. Your sense of your own worth is a vital organ without which you cannot live. So these self-protective biases have incredibly important like psychological roles for us. So I don't want to be like, well, you're all dumb and messed up, because that's A, not good for you, and B, it's not true, right? Like, it's not that you're reasoning less than perfectly when compared to some ideal standard, but it makes no sense to try to hold yourself to this ideal standard when you're a finite cognitive agent in an incredibly complicated world. Okay. So the question you might ask is, like, are we just stuck with this? Like, are we just stuck being irrational? And I'm going to say yes and no. We are stuck with being finite reasoners. Nothing you can do about that. I mean, you can bring about the technological singularity and merge with it. That's your options. Either that or you're stuck with your Homo sapien brain. So yeah, you're stuck with having less than perfect information, less than perfect reasoning abilities, and less time than you want to make decisions. That's not going away as far as I can tell. So we're stuck with less than perfect reasoning a lot of the time. But I want to make a quick case to you that that doesn't mean that we're unable to adapt and to improve our reasoning in the light of this stuff. And it's especially important to keep this in mind when you tell yourself this evolutionary story. The tendency when people tell evolutionary stories is to think that it's hardwired. There's no point in even trying to like mitigate the effects of it. I want to argue to you that that is not true at all. So I propose to you that we are born ignorant, and that's the best thing about us as a species. The best thing about us is that we're born these floppy, useless little babies, and that you have to learn everything yourself. So compare, this is material from the developmental psychologist Alison Gopnik. Compare crows and chickens. A crow is dependent on its parents to be fed for about 2 years. Right? They are born useless and must be fed for years, literally years, far, far longer than most birds need to be taken care of. But the result is that crows and ravens are able to solve problems up to the level of like a 4-year-old human. So this is a picture of a raven, I think. They put a bit of food in the bottom of a tall beaker with some water in it, and the ravens are able to figure out that if they put stuff in the tube to raise the water level, the food will rise up and they'll be able to reach it. It's pretty clever, right? Rising water levels, buoyancy, displacement, all that's in play in this tiny little bird brain. Compare that to chickens. They are born, they are chickens. That's it. Like, it's a couple of weeks and you're as fully developed, cognitively speaking, you're great at pecking at things. And that's more or less your life as a chicken. Like, they are vastly less able to solve complex problems, deal with novel situations. All of the stuff that makes you a good reasoner is absent, or relatively speaking. I mean, it's not that they're not reasoners, but they're far less complex than ravens because they come hardwired, right? We do not come hardwired, sorry. We come hardwired for lots of things. We come hardwired to move your hand away from very hot things, to struggle when you've got your air restricted, lots of things are built in. But the thing that's characteristic about humans is how open we are and how plastic, how adaptable our brains actually are. It's the best thing about us. Right? Our capacity to change ourselves is the reason that we took over this planet. So we are not programmed with all this stuff just like indelibly written on our souls. We're programmed with this stuff as the basics, and then it's really up to us to do a whole bunch of adjustments. We can change ourselves in radical, radical ways. And so hopefully this is how we can act with respect to our biases. So yeah. I don't really have a lot to say about this. To be honest, I don't really have much to tell you about strategies for overcoming these biases. I hope what I've said is something of an argument for maybe not wanting to overcome them completely. Like, possibly you want to just live with these things. But you do want to have some sense of them, and you do want to be able to manage them in some way. So becoming aware of your biases is the main thing, I would say. And if you've been subject to blind spot bias, I would recommend that you try to mitigate that. Because the chances are you're one of the people that have these biases. Yeah? Chances are. So being aware of them is the most important thing that I can suggest. And it's the condition for the possibility of doing anything else about them, which is why I thought it would be worth talking to you about them. Not just in your life, but in your critical reasoning, right? Because anytime you're making an informal argument, you're making judgments that are potentially subject to these biases, yeah? All of these informal reasonings where you say, like, look, this makes sense to me. Anytime you're saying that, you've got the door open to all of these cognitive biases getting in there. So being aware of them is the #1 way. This has helped me enormously in my marriage, I will tell you. Like, things like you believe something happens more often if it happened recently. So this is a recency heuristic, recency bias. If you say, oh, God, like, I always do the dishes. I always do the dishes. Well, I did the dishes today. Does that really mean that I always do the dishes? No, right? And you'll be more likely to be able to catch yourself in that kind of thing, right? You'll be more likely to get some space from your own reasoning processes and be able to intervene on them. So one way of doing this is to use confirmation bias against itself, right? Make your hypothesis. So confirmation bias is when you believe, when you only see or information that confirms your hypothesis is much more salient to you. So make your hypothesis sometimes, I'm subject to confirmation bias, right? You say, here's a hypothesis. I think I'm only seeing what I want to see. What evidence can I adduce for that hypothesis? It really works. It really does. Because you're no longer like trying to like go against yourself. You're saying, here's an idea. What evidence can I come up with to support it? And very often, I've done this with myself. I do this with myself regularly. Very often, I come up with counter evidence. I always do the dishes. That's my hypothesis. Am I doing confirmation bias? What evidence is there? Oh yeah, Celia did the dishes. Okay. Hypothesis confirmed. It's sort of like ego-affirming still. This is a way of making being wrong ego-affirming, right? So I believe that I'm subject to confirmation bias. How can I confirm my hypothesis? Oh, I found evidence to confirm my hypothesis. Hooray. It actually works. The other thing is, of course, to cultivate epistemic humility. That is to not labor under the delusion that you're always right, to accept the fact that you are sometimes going to be wrong. This is harder than it should be, I guess. It's harder than it sounds. Or maybe you're anxious and depressed and you live in epistemic humility. That's your base state of being, and you're just like, I'm a piece of garbage all the time. In that case, you don't need to cultivate any more epistemic humility. Maybe cultivate the opposite or something like that. But like, even then, you can turn that on itself and say, like, I'm wrong all the time. What if I'm wrong about that? Yeah? Like, these are the kind of, you kind of have to trick yourself into being rational in some sense. And I would say the main thing is probably to organize decision-making around these biases. So there's a case to be made that this is what science is. So the philosopher of science, Helen Longino, argues that objectivity in science is a social product. right? It's not that any one scientist is likely to get to the truth. What we do is set up an incentive structure where I want to prove X and you want to prove not X, and we are forced to respectfully talk to each other. Right? We are forced to interact with somebody whose incentive structure opposes our own. Yeah? They say scientists want their theories to be disconfirmed. I have never met a scientist like that. What they want is to participate in a social process that comes up with the truth. You know, nobody, like, that's how you get grants, by being right. You don't get grants by having your stuff proven wrong. So there's the incentive to be right, but science distills the subjective biases out of the process precisely by having people with different incentives making the decisions together. Yeah? So consensus is how you get objectivity, not just one person being perfectly rational. And you can do things like that in your life. You know, you can build your decision making around the belief that you're sometimes not going to get it right. Okay. All right, well, that's all I had. Thank you for coming to this weird gym and sitting on benches and listening to me talk about biases. Tuesday, we're going to talk about cognition and mental health. And hopefully some of this stuff will be relevant to that discussion as well.